The Golden State Killer: How DNA and Genealogy Uncovered a Phantom Predator. In the quiet suburbs of Sacramento County, a shadow moved through neighborhoods in the dead of night. For decades, the man who would eventually be known as the Golden State Killer evaded capture, leaving behind a trail of terror, trauma, and unanswered questions. His story represents one of the most extraordinary cold case breakthroughs in criminal history, a tale of horror, persistence, and ultimately justice through science. This is the story of how cutting-edge DNA technology and genealogical detective work finally gave a face to a phantom that had haunted California for more than 40 years. The Reign of Terror. The saga begins in 1974 in Visalia, California, where a burglar dubbed the Visalia Ransacker broke into homes, sometimes simply moving objects around, stealing personal mementos rather than valuables. It was strange, unsettling behavior that would later be recognized as the early signature of a predator developing his methodology. By 1976, the crimes had escalated dramatically. Moving to the Sacramento area, the perpetrator began a series of sexual assaults that earned him a new moniker, the East Area Rapist. His methods were meticulous and terrifying. He would stalk neighborhoods for days, learning routines, identifying vulnerabilities, and planning his attacks with military precision. As one investigator noted, he was able to spot weakness, almost like a predator, which this guy is, make no mistake. The attacks created a wave of fear that transformed entire communities. Gun sales skyrocketed, ammunition sold out at local stores, and hardware stores exhausted their supplies of locks as residents frantically secured their homes. Women enrolled in self-defense classes, and the carefree lifestyle that had characterized suburban California was replaced by hypervigilance and fear. One survivor described the moment of her attack with haunting clarity. Standing up in front of me was this man with a ski mask on, holding a large butcher knife. It was sheer terror. Another recalled how our horror movie became reality on the night of October 29, 1977. As time went on, the attacks became increasingly violent. By 1979, the East Area Rapist had moved to Southern California, where his crimes escalated to murder. He became known as the original Night Stalker, a name that would later merge with his other identities when DNA evidence confirmed they were the same person. Between 1976 and 1986, this single perpetrator committed at least 13 murders, 51 sexual assaults, and more than 120 residential burglaries across multiple California counties. His victims range from teenagers to adults in their 40s, targeting women alone, women with children, and even couples in their homes. For a decade, he spread terror throughout California, from Sacramento to Orange County, across 15 different jurisdictions. And then suddenly, the attacks stopped. The monster vanished. The long cold case. For decades, the case of the East Area Rapist original stalker remained one of America's most notorious unsolved mysteries. Traditional investigative methods had failed to identify the perpetrator despite substantial evidence collected from numerous crime scenes. The geographical spread of the crimes complicated matters, and as law enforcement agencies across different jurisdictions didn't initially recognize they were dealing with the same perpetrator. It wasn't until 2001, through DNA analysis, that investigators definitively connected the rapes in Northern California with the murders in Southern California. The confirmation that these crimes were committed by a single individual renewed interest in the case. This amalgamated series of crimes needed a new name, and crime writer Michelle McNamara coined what would become the most recognized, the Golden State Killer. Despite this breakthrough, the case remained unsolved. The DNA evidence confirmed the crimes were linked, but it didn't identify the perpetrator. The killer's profile wasn't in any criminal database. For the survivors and families of victims, this meant living with the knowledge that the person who had devastated their lives remained free, perhaps living a normal life somewhere while they continued to suffer. As survivor Gay Hardwick expressed, "I always had faith that he would be caught. And then a year goes by and you're not healed, you're not better. And then 3 years go by and now it's okay. He got away with it. There was no closure. There was no justice for forever." By 2016, the case had gone cold for decades, with little hope of resolution. But behind the scenes, a revolution in forensic science was about to change everything. The scientific revolution. The breakthrough that would eventually crack the case began in 1985, ironically, just as the Golden State Killer's reign of terror appeared to be ending. That year marked the beginning of forensic DNA typing, a technology that wasn't available during the years when the crimes were being committed. Fortunately, investigators had preserved biological evidence collected from the crime scenes, anticipating that future technologies might provide answers that weren't possible at the time. This foresight would prove crucial decades later. The ability to extract and analyze DNA from crime scene evidence evolved significantly over the years. By the early 2000s, investigators could develop comprehensive DNA profiles from minimal biological material. But these profiles were only useful if they matched someone in a criminal database or a known suspect. The Golden State Killer's DNA didn't match any profile in the FBI's National DNA Database, leaving investigators at another dead end. The true revolution came with the rise of consumer DNA testing services like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and Family Tree DNA. Millions of people began submitting their DNA to these services to learn about their heritage and connect with distant relatives. Simultaneously, public genealogy databases like GeneMatch emerged, allowing users to upload their genetic information to find relatives across platforms. What most users of these services didn't initially realize was that by submitting their DNA, they were potentially creating connections not just to living relatives, but to unknown individuals who might have left DNA at crime scenes decades earlier. The investigative breakthrough. By 2018, the case had garnered renewed attention, partly due to Michelle McNamara's posthumously published book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. Despite the book's popularity, the case remained unsolved until a team of investigators led by Paul Holes decided to try something unprecedented. The investigative team developed a novel approach. They would take the DNA profile developed from semen recovered at one of the crime scenes and upload it to public genealogy databases to search for potential relatives of the killer. This technique, called forensic genetic genealogy, had never been used in a major criminal investigation before. The actual process was more complex and controversial than initially reported. According to court records accessed by the Los Angeles Times, investigators first sent the DNA to Family Tree DNA, which created a profile and allowed law enforcement to set up a fake account to search for matching customers. When that produced only distant leads, a civilian geneticist working with investigators uploaded the forensic profile to MyHeritage. It was this search that identified a closer relative who would help break the case. The team then uploaded the profile to GeneMatch, an open-source platform that aggregated data from various providers and had less restrictive policies regarding law enforcement access. There, they found distant cousins who shared enough DNA with the killer to begin constructing a family tree. Working with genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, investigators painstakingly built extensive family trees, working backward to find common ancestors, and then forward again to identify all possible descendants. This process was incredibly labor-intensive, requiring months of meticulous work to narrow down the pool of potential suspects. The breakthrough initially led investigators to an elderly man in a nursing home in Oregon, but he turned out to be an incredibly distant relation, with no shared ancestor for 900 years. Despite this setback, the team persisted. As they continued mapping family connections, they eventually identified a family group they codenamed the Wright family. Within this family, they narrowed their focus to a pool of just 6 male cousins who could potentially be the killer based on age, location during the crimes, and other factors. Among these 6 men was 72-year-old Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who had worked in 2 California police departments during the 1970s. When investigators examined DeAngelo's background more closely, they discovered he had blue eyes matching the profile they had constructed and had lived in the areas where the crimes occurred during the relevant time periods. The final chapter, Arrest and Resolution. In April 2018, investigators began surveillance on DeAngelo. Working with local garbage collectors, they retrieved items he had discarded that might contain DNA, including a tissue and DNA from a car door handle. When this DNA was compared to the crime scene evidence, it was a perfect match. On April 24, 2018, authorities arrested Joseph James DeAngelo at his home in Sacramento County, bringing an end to one of the longest and most terrifying manhunts in American history. The 72-year-old former police officer had been living in plain sight for decades in the very community he had once terrorized as the East Area Rapist. The news of DeAngelo's arrest shocked the nation. The Golden State Killer, who had seemed like a phantom for so long, suddenly had a face, a name, and a biography. He had been a police officer during some of his crimes, using his knowledge of police procedures to evade capture. He had married, had children, and lived a seemingly normal life while harboring the darkest of secrets. For survivors and victims' families, the arrest brought a complex mix of emotions: relief, vindication, reopened wounds, and a chance for long-delayed justice. As survivor Chris Pedretti noted, the arrest also brought together many of the survivors who formed close bonds with one another as they prepared to face their attacker in court. In 2020, facing overwhelming evidence, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, sparing him the death penalty. At his sentencing hearing, survivors stood up to confront the man who had terrorized them decades earlier. One survivor called him the devil incarnate and a sick monster, while another described how my safety was shattered as a masked man. DeAngelo, yielding a knife, told me he would kill me. These powerful statements gave survivors a voice they had been denied for decades. The human impact beyond the case. The Golden State Killer case left an indelible mark on the survivors, the communities he terrorized, and the investigators who spent years trying to identify him. For many survivors, the arrest and conviction brought a measure of closure but couldn't erase decades of trauma. Survivor Chris Pedretti, who was attacked by DeAngelo when she was just 15 years old, found an unexpected silver lining in the aftermath of his arrest. For the first time, she felt a strong sense of support for what she'd been through and wanted to pay it forward. Together with fellow survivor Gay Hardwick, she started a Facebook support group that grew to more than 600 members, helping other trauma survivors speak out and find healing. The connections formed among survivors proved powerful and lasting. When one survivor, Phyllis, was diagnosed with terminal cancer, the others rallied around her. We gave her an early Christmas. One of the survivors called in and sang Silent Night to her. Our therapist wrote her a poem and called and read it to her. We were there until the day she died. That's kind of like how deep these friendships went. For the law enforcement officers who had pursued the case for decades, DeAngelo's identification and arrest represented the culmination of careers spent seeking justice. Paul Holes, who had worked the case for 24 years and developed the genetic genealogy approach that cracked it, finally had answers to questions that had consumed much of his professional life. Legacy and ethical questions. The Golden State Killer case has transformed cold case investigations worldwide. Since DeAngelo's arrest in 2018, the technique of forensic genetic genealogy has been used to identify suspects in dozens of other cold cases. In 2018 alone, suspects were identified in 28 cold cases using similar methods. Among these solved cases was the 1967 rape and murder of Susan Galvin, whose killer was identified as Frank Wypich through genealogical mapping, despite Wypich having died in 1987. Similarly, the 1979 murder of Anna Marie Hlafka was solved when DNA from her fingernail scrapings was linked through familial DNA to Jerry Animal McFadden, a serial rapist and murderer who had been executed in 1999 for other crimes. However, the Golden State Killer investigation also raised important ethical and privacy concerns. The method used to identify DeAngelo involved searching genealogy databases without explicit warrants, potentially accessing the genetic information of millions of people who had never consented to having their DNA used for law enforcement purposes. After the case became public, GDmatch updated their privacy policy to explicitly inform users that their genetic information could be searched by law enforcement. This transparency was important but the case opened a broader conversation about genetic privacy and the extent to which DNA submitted for personal or genealogical reasons could be used for other purposes. The case highlights a fundamental tension in modern society. How do we balance the clear public good of solving violent crimes against the potential erosion of privacy? As one expert noted, the tools that can catch criminals could potentially be used in more concerning ways if not properly regulated. The power of persistence. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from the Golden State Killer case is the value of persistence. For decades, investigators kept the case alive, preserving evidence they couldn't yet analyze and pursuing new investigative avenues as they became available. Survivors continued to share their stories, ensuring the case wouldn't be forgotten. Family members of victims maintained their calls for justice, even when it seemed impossibly distant. When DeAngelo was finally identified, it was the result of innovative thinking applied to evidence collected 4 decades earlier. The semen collected from a rape kit in Ventura County in 1980, from the rape and murder of Charlene Smith and the murder of her husband, Lyman Smith, contained the DNA that would eventually lead investigators to DeAngelo in 2018. This breakthrough demonstrates how advances in technology can breathe new life into cold cases, providing answers and closure that once seemed impossible. It reminds us that for victims of unsolved crimes, the passage of time doesn't diminish the need for resolution. The case also highlights the power of collaboration across disciplines and jurisdictions. The team that ultimately identified DeAngelo included law enforcement officers, DNA experts, genetic genealogists, and others who contributed their specialized knowledge to solve a puzzle that had confounded conventional approaches for decades. The Golden State Killer case represents both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of a decades-long search for a predator who had evaded capture, and the birth of a new era in forensic investigation. For families who continue to wait for answers about loved ones lost to violence, the case offers hope that even the coldest of cases can eventually be solved with persistence, innovation, and the continued advancement of science. As we look to the future, the legacy of this landmark case will continue to influence how cold cases are investigated, how evidence is preserved, and how society balances the promise of new technologies against the imperative to protect individual privacy. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that behind every cold case are real people, victims, survivors, families, and communities who deserve answers, no matter how long they may take to find.